warm welcome. My name is Jannie Lilja, and I'm the Director of Studies of Peace and Development Research here at SIPRI. So obviously these days, these are the highlight of my year, and I hope that you have enjoyed the past 3 days of inspiring and insightful discussions. So on the first day, we had the launch of the Environment of Peace report that highlighted the convergence of climate change and environmental destruction on the one hand with security and conflict risks. And one of the key recommendations was that we need to act fast, but that different organizations have different roles to play. So the Stockholm Forum is all about bringing different communities together, getting to know each other. On that note, I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming Franck Bousquet to this session. He is a Deputy Director with the International Monetary Fund. And the IMF is currently stepping up to the compound challenges of today. But Franck, you used to be spearheading the fragility, conflict, violence strategy with the World Bank. And then you basically moved down a block across the street on Pennsylvania Avenue to do the same at the International Monetary Fund. So this is a very impressive track record. So my question to you is, what is driving your focus on conflict and fragility?
All right, well, thank you, Jannie. Very good engaging with you. We know each other for some time. Very happy to be here as well. I think many thanks, of course, to SIPRI Forum, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Sweden is always a key partner, I think, on this agenda, promoting security, peace. Over the past years, I've been working for 20 years at the bank on Africa, Middle East, especially focusing on fragile and conflict-affected states. Started with Democratic Republic of Congo, Chad, working on Yemen, working West Bank, Gaza. And I have to say that for me, that's where I see where the international community needs to step up the most. I love this forum because it's basically a crowd of peace, humanitarian, security, development actors that are like-minded, looking about how can we make sure that the whole international community break the silo and enhance our support for those most vulnerable countries. That's what drives me. It's not easy. You don't see the results overnight. It requires short-term action, like it was said yesterday, for long-term challenge. But at the same time, everybody tries to do its best. And there is a lot of innovation that also I think is a key driver for everybody, not only for me working on this agenda, is that if you don't work with humanitarian, financial institutions, development actors, security actors, what's the end result? So I think really it's pushing the agenda on complex challenge, making sure that you're always patient, that you manage expectation, but at the same time that you are thinking about what people need the most, the support from international institutions and other partners. That's what drives me.
So thank you, Franck. But why is it important for the IMF to launch this strategy right now?
So, there are 3 reasons, if I may say. The first one, I would say, it's really this link that sometimes not everybody appreciates between peace and stability on one hand and macroeconomic stability. And that's what the IMF is about. So obviously we know that fragility impacts significantly fiscal, monetary, and external balance. Fragility, conflict impacts significantly balance of payment position. So that usually people understand how conflict is going to really impact the economy. Now what is important is it works the other way around. The whole point about macroeconomic stability and inclusive growth is actually quite important to reduce fragility and support countries moving out of fragility and becoming more resilient. And I think that's what the IMF is about. It's looking at macroeconomic stability. It's about helping countries strengthening this institution. The whole point about capacity development, which is so important, and that's not done overnight. It's actually taking 5, 10, 15 years, but helping countries to have strong and accountable institutions on macroeconomic policies, central banking, fiscal monetary policies. All that is important. So at the core of the strategy is really to emphasize this link that goes both ways between macroeconomic stability, that's what the IMF is about, and the bigger picture for which all of you are around, And that's what I gather from the forum, which is about peace and stability. So that's really one reason. It's because it's our mandate. The whole point about the strategy is not to expand the mandate of the fund. Absolutely not. It's not about the IMF becoming a humanitarian or development actors. The opposite. It's actually to better partner with other actors that are essential in these settings so that we can be more effective by doing policy advice, capacity development, and of course financing, which are three key instruments. So that's the first big reason why we are stepping up our engagement. The second one is because if you look at our membership, we have about 40 countries that are fragile and conflict-affected states, which is about 20% of our membership. This is significant. So it's actually and you will see later on, I hope I will be able to provide more information. It's about how can we tailor our engagement being more fit for purpose for those most vulnerable countries. And as we have heard over the past 2-3 days, it's not only about those countries. There is the whole point about spillover. We have seen today, and we have seen in many contexts in the Sahel, how conflict and fragility can cross easily the border. And therefore extremely important to not only look at this group of countries, about 40 countries, but also the risk of instability to neighboring countries and neighboring regions. And that's why for us it's so important. And last but not least, I would say that unfortunately, the landscape is not improving. I mean, we heard, including from the report that you launched recently, if you look at forced displacement, we are actually getting number to the roof. It used to be 80 million forcibly displaced people. When we finalized the strategy that was approved by our board in March, now it's 90 plus, with all the refugees coming from the war in Ukraine. We have the number of violent conflicts that has never been that high. So if you look at all some key indicators, and that being, of course, exacerbated by climate change, that's why it's so important that you're focusing on this link, gender, demographics, it's really getting not in the right direction. Plus, over the past 2-3 years, those countries have been the ones that have been hit the hardest by the pandemic. Those fragile and conflict-affected states, sometimes we don't emphasize the point that if you look at debt, if you look at inflation, if you look at per capita income, they have been actually hit the hardest. They will not recover their per capita income of 2019 before 2024. And now more recently, obviously, the spillover and the impact of the war in Ukraine had huge impact in terms of food insecurity. Why? You know it. We had many sessions. It was great engagement over the past 2-3 days on this topic. It's about food price, fertilizer price, and guess who gets most impacted? Most vulnerable countries, including fragile and conflict states. So there is a real risk, and that's our message, of those countries falling behind the rest of the world, with all the spillover risk and instability that it can bring. So there are really three main reasons. One is obviously because macroeconomic stability has a key role to play in terms of promoting peace. Is that enough? No, it's not that enough. We are just part of a much bigger and complex puzzle made of all the actors present at the SIPRI Forum, but we should do our part as well. The second reason is really looking at serving our member, trying to see how we can be even more effective. And the third one is really looking at, over the past 2 years, the situation is really getting worse, and there is this risk of divergence that is actually quite significant, not only for those countries, but also for the neighboring countries and regions.
So it really bears testimony to this phenomenon of intersecting and converging risks.
Yes.
Could you outline the core elements of the new fragility conflict strategy?
So, I mean, maybe if I may, before looking at the strategy, let's make it clear. It's not today that the IMF starts to engage with fragile and conflict-affected states. It's true that we don't talk enough about it, but you may know that over the past, for instance, 10 years, the IMF has been providing for $10 billion to fragile and conflict-affected states. If you look at our capacity development over the past year, which is quite important, capacity development, it's about supporting central bank, it's about supporting Ministry of Finance in key areas such as public financial management, anti-money laundering, so all the governance issues that are so important, looking about all the statistics element. So all those elements, if you look at the fund overall, 30% of our capacity development is for those countries. So anyway, the fund has been engaging for the past decades, and really the whole point about the strategy is to boost those efforts, not only quantitatively, but also qualitatively. And I would say that maybe the strategy is really looking at three pillars, three buckets. The first one is actually tailoring our engagement by better taking into account the key drivers of fragility and conflict. And so how do you see a similarity with the World Bank? It's about looking at some key principles, but making sure that we operationalize them differently, because we have different mandates. So key drivers of fragility and conflict were many humanitarian actors, development agency, foreign affairs, SIDA, but many other partners are working on. The whole point is to how can we get this intelligence, the political economy analysis, the assessment of fragility, to see how we can best tailor our program design, conditionalities for the financing part, but also capacity development and also policy advice. So one is really the first bucket, which is really about how to best tailor our engagement. Why tailoring it? Because those countries are facing complex challenge, but you will tell me, any country is facing complex challenge today, but they're also facing unique challenge. When you have significant governance challenge, when you have horizontal or geographical inequalities, when you have social contract, which is not necessarily strong, when you have sometimes the legitimacy of the states, which is questioned by many actors in society, all that has direct implication on the way of engaging, the way of sequencing reforms and supporting those countries. So the first bucket is really how to best tailor our engagement. The second one, which I think is super important, it's more better proximity with our member countries. So it's good to say what needs to be done. It's even better to say what and trying to support saying how. In many countries, the IMF is supporting countries not only from Washington, but also in country. So with the strategy, we are clearly getting more additional resource. So it's not only a strategy paper, they're actually additional resource. To do what? To increase by 12% our workforce working on fragile conflict-affected states.
And states.
Mainly 90% of them in those countries. Is it important? Big time. Why? Well, when you provide support to local authorities, but also when you engage with partners, very difficult to do it when you are not in the country. It will help us by having 40 additional local economists in all those countries, by strengthening the office, but also having more regular engagement with the local authorities, engaging with other partners that we will not be able to engage if we didn't have this presence. We're also expanding our coverage of fragile and conflict-affected states. Very important as well to be more present. And last but not least, we are going to have 30 additional capacity development experts in our regional center, but also in country. So I think we're really boosting. The issue is not to become a humanitarian agency by far. It's actually to have a minimum of presence that will allow us to better tailor our engagement to the specific constraints, not only in terms of capacity, but also political economy, all these issues that are being faced by the country. And the third bucket is really looking at enhancing our partnership. As I said before, macroeconomic stability is important, obviously, in terms of reducing fragility, but it's just one element among others. So what we did over the past year is that we have engaged, and actually we engaged with SIPRI Forum, we have engaged with about 55 organizations. The Red Cross, the UN agency, PBSO, I see all our dear friends and colleagues here in this room, many, of course, first and foremost, those fragile and conflict-affected states, our members. So we've basically engaged with peace, security, humanitarian actors, and of course those countries, civil societies, but also think tanks. Why? Because that's an area which is very complex. And that's why, I see the same objective of the SIPRI Forum, bringing different community of practice, bringing different organizations with different mandates. Now you start to see what you can do collectively to best help countries that are in the driving seat. So the whole point about partnership, which is to say many of those drivers of fragility are macrocritical. When you're looking at food security, you better engage with the World Food Programme to really see how you can, with the World Bank, look at the social safety net programs and incorporate that in your policy advice. When you look at the countries impacted by refugee crisis, you may want to engage with the UNHCR, the United Nations in charge of refugees, so that they can really better inform our engagement about labor market, how to best integrate refugee, what does it mean in terms of cost for the economy versus advantage over the long term. So the whole point about the partnership is to say, how can we best engage in a very pragmatic manner with those key actors, especially on the ground, that will help us to better inform our engagement. So there are really three buckets. One, about better tailoring. Second one, about having more staff on the ground. And third, which is also very important in this context of the SIPRI Forum, which is partnering and scaling up our engagement with humanitarian, peace, security, and of course with our sister organization, the one on crossing the street, except when it's virtual, you don't need to even do it, which was even easier for me. It's actually the World Bank. So with the World Bank, the whole point is really to ensure full consistency in terms of classification of countries, in terms of leveraging all the assessment that the World Bank is doing, in terms of fragility assessment, so that it can better inform our engagement, and so that we don't have to do it. So it's really important.
Could I pick up on that, on the classification of conflict-affected and fragile states? I mean, I know that you have a preventive ambition with this strategy. So if you want to act preventively, would you also considering engaging with a strategy in countries that are not yet fragile?
So, I mean, that's an important point. That's the whole point about prevention. As you may know, the World Bank issued with the UN a report a few years ago, when I was still working there, called Pathway for Peace, which was basically making the point about the prevention. $1 invested in prevention saves $16 down the road. Now, don't question me on the number, because it's highly questionable, but the whole point is actually important. It's about focusing on prevention. And the World Bank is really moving on this agenda. It's fantastic to see that. It's the same for the IMF. This strategy, obviously, is focusing on those fragile and conflict-affected states, about 40 members, as I mentioned before. But many of those principles are actually relevant for countries that may display some fragility while not necessarily classified. And that's why you see, for instance, tailoring the engagement, partnership, all that is actually quite relevant beyond countries being classified as such. And that's why prevention is important. Prevention is about, at the end of the day, what do we all want in terms of the international community? Is to make sure that those group of fragile and conflict states is not increasing. So the whole point is to look at some of those countries before it's too late. It's engaging in dialogue about inclusive growth, about tackling inequality. High inequality is very important for the IMF. This is having significant impact in terms of stability, in terms of growth. So I think, yes, the prevention aspect is also quite important.
So that's a great segue to my next question. Since we have been talking a lot about the interrelationship between climate change and conflict, what is your take on that, especially in light of the fact that preceding your strategy, there was another thematic strategy focusing on climate in the IMF?
So, for us, it's very clear. If you look at climate change, and if you look at fragility and conflict, there is a common denominator, is that they have a macroeconomic impact for our members. And that's why they are relevant for the fund. And that's why we're stepping up our engagement in those two areas. That's why the theme of the year of this forum is so relevant. Now, I will come back maybe later on the way that we integrate the work, because it's actually not to silo approach, but the opposite. So when you look especially in those countries, fragile and conflict-affected states, obviously climate change is a threat multiplier of fragility and conflict. You know it well, it acts through different channels. When you are going to have climate change induced food security, when you're going to have movement of population, because they are looking for land, water, which are the key resource, obviously this generates conflicts.
It's a driver of fragility.
Completely. It exacerbates. I like this notion of compound risk, because it's very difficult to actually say what is attributable to its factors. You have gender inequality, you have governance, you have elite capture, you have climate change. At the end of the day, it needs to be appreciated at the country level, because each country is fragile in its own way. And that's something which is very important. It's good to talk in general terms, but at the end of the day, the application needs to be at the country level. So to come back to climate change, obviously this also has significant impact in terms of revenue loss for countries. So basically, clearly exacerbating the drivers of fragility. I think there is an IMF staff research report that shows that low-income countries, many of them actually are fragile and conflict-affected states, could have, if we see an increase of temperature of 1 degree Celsius, an impact on their lowering the GDP by 1.2 percentage points. Wow. So obviously climate change is macrocritical. Fragility, conflict, I mentioned it before, extremely important from a macroeconomic perspective, and both of them are being tackled by strategies, which at the end of the day are very well integrated at the country level.
we have been discussing transition a lot, transition to less carbon-dependent societies, and sometimes not all good things go together. So macroeconomic stability and peace do not necessarily go together. When some transitional measures may trigger societal tensions, how do you see the role of the IMF in those contexts?
So, I mean, it comes back to the agenda on climate change, which is extremely important, but also the type of resource and support that is being provided. I would say that any change and reform obviously needs to be analyzed by looking at the impact on different groups in a society, including of certain reforms. So when we talk, going back now to the strategy, Jannie, on the tailoring, it's not just an abstract. What we are looking at is rolling out what is called country engagement strategy in each fragile and conflict-affected states, by better looking not only on the short term, looking at the next balance of payment of crisis, but more medium, long term, what are the key drivers of fragility, and what does it mean for our engagement in terms of program design, in terms of capacity development, and in terms of policy advice. So when you look about transition to green economy, for instance, but you could look at any other reform, what is very important is to really understand the unintended consequence of certain features of programs, and therefore what does it mean in terms of better calibrating and better tailoring? What does it mean in terms of sequencing reforms? There may be many priorities, but some of them, given the context, given the instability, given the weak legitimacy of the state in certain situations, may not work. So the whole point about the country engagement strategy is to look at all those key drivers of fragility. Climate change, gender is a big one in many countries as well, and looking at, and so what? What does it mean for our engagement to make sure that we'll be more effective and better understanding the granularity at the country level we are in driving system.
So the country engagement strategy integrates this comprehensive analysis of conflict, of climate and gender, and on that basis you tailor the actual engagement.
And
so,
on that, if I may, you know, the whole point about the IMF is not to duplicate what is being done by other organizations. So the bank is carrying out in all fragile and conflict-affected states risk-resilient assessment. The UN is actually doing similar fragility assessment that are extremely important. I know that Sweden, in some cases, is doing the same. The whole point for us is that's what is partnership about. How to best leverage those assessments from actors that have the right skills so that we can focus on not really doing the same thing, but instead trying to see what does that mean for our engagement. And I think that's what really came out from the consultation with all the actors from humanitarian peace security. It was saying, one, it's very welcome to make sure that you are not going to provide support in this environment to the same way that you provide in a more stable environment, because conditions on the ground are radically different. And also very important that you are not duplicating what we are doing, but instead that you'll be leveraging all the analytics. And that's why being on the ground present is so important, because if you are not present on the ground, very difficult to see this work.
So let's move on then to implementation, how you will be rolling it out. So in concrete ways, how is this conflict fragility strategy expected to shape IMF's work? And you can maybe answer the question at the backdrop of the climate crisis that we've been discussing.
So, I mean, at the end of the day, the IMF has three instruments, okay? So you have the policy advice, the Article 4 consultation, you have the capacity development, and then you have the program design, the financing. So the first one, which is about Article 4 consultation, it's very important. It's looking regularly every year about the health of the economy of the countries. So here it's really a push about being more systematic in terms of capturing the macro criticality of certain key drivers of fragility, food insecurity, forced displacement, climate change, so what we discussed. So I think that's very important. If you look also at our engagement in terms of capacity development, I think the strategy will be quite important. Not only because we will have additional experts on the ground, which is exactly what the country is asking for, saying, please, let's focus on the what needs to be done, but also on the how. But also, we'll be able to better integrate capacity development with the lending, with the program design, so that we can prioritize our focus on the key priorities at that time of those countries. So really, capacity development is critical, making sure that the priorities I mentioned before, central banking, public financial management, or it could be about anti-money laundering, it could be about debt management, that we really focus on what is the most important for those countries. Very important to realize you're not operating on the same environment than helping much more stable countries. There is weak capacity, so how can we act and prioritize accordingly? The last piece is about financing. And here I would like to say 2 points. I think the first one, which is really looking at how to best tailor program design, conditionalities. And here it's about having parsimony to really focus on what is the most important, but also looking about the unintended consequences. And what does that mean in terms of impact on the fragility environment, which is, I think, extremely important. It's also about, I would like to also mention, linked with climate financing, Jannie, the fact that just last April, our board approved the Resilience Sustainability Trust. So it's quite important because it's really helping those countries to step up and be able to address long-term challenges such as climate change or pandemic preparedness by providing concessional financing. Those countries, that's what they need the most. And this has been approved in April. The ambition is to have a $45 billion financing vehicle that would precisely help those countries that are eligible. About 3/4 of the membership, about 143 countries will be eligible, and we expect that could benefit to fragile conflict states if they meet criteria, of course. So that's quite important. This is really helping and also making the link with what we discussed. We don't see climate change on one hand and fragility conflict on the other hand.
Yeah.
When you are looking at the country level, not only will be incorporating climate change, I mentioned gender, also in terms of key drivers of fragility for our engagement, but also there will be this source of financing, concessional, long-term maturity that will help those countries to make those change.
I realize that the clock is ticking, so I will dive right into the issue of partnerships. You mentioned parsimony and sort of prioritizing really hard. So it would be interesting to hear your thoughts about how the IMF is partnering up with others to achieve those key priorities, these key collective outcomes in very difficult environments.
So partnership is important. I mean, I like to say mission-driven partnership. So it's not, because it's high transaction cost partnership. At the end of the day, we're here to support countries. And therefore, partnership for us has to be done at the country level. What makes sense given the situation? Is it looking at the refugee crisis? Is it looking at the risk of famine? Is it about looking at the health, education, looking at all the social sector, which are so important for fragile and conflict states? So depending on the topics, we'll be engaging a lot with our sister organization, with which the partnership is excellent, because the World Bank, for instance, has expertise at the sectoral level, but we may want to engage with UN agencies. I see some of our colleagues are here present today, depending on the added value that represents. So for us, partnership is important. It's not the end game. It's being able to benefit from the intel, to benefit from the analytics, to benefit from the expertise of all the partners so that it can best inform and having more granular our engagement. And yes, I mean, when we are looking at the strategy, we have been doing consultation outside the IMF, but also within the IMF. And there are a number of cases where this partnership exists. The whole point is to make it more systematic.
Thank you. So I will bundle my last two questions into one. So the first one is, what does success look like under the FCS strategy? And then what would be your key takeaway from the Stockholm Forum back to IMF headquarters?
I mean, success, from the IMF, it's of course about macroeconomic stability. It's about inclusive, sustainable growth. It's about making sure that at the end of the day, you help those people who need it the most in terms of starting a business, in terms of having savings, having confidence in the economy. I think, at the end of the day, we are part of the international community. So it's one piece of the puzzle. We all want more. We want countries to move out of fragility. So it's one piece, but it's obviously humility is important, recognizing what I mentioned 3 times, because it's just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. For us, it's looking at having more tailored engagement with the country, better informed. It's to have more staff on the ground, but it's also about having better partnership to once again being more effective and impactful. Key takeaway from this forum, I think the whole point about focusing about environmental degradation, climate change, and fragility and conflict resonate a lot with us. Of course, we see it from our own mandate, because it's macro-critical and how we can step up. It was sad to see the latest number that you shared. I think definitely, when you look at all trends of refugees, conflict, violence, but also in terms of climate change, it's actually very worrisome. At the same time, for us, it means that everybody needs to step up. And I think that's why I call is actually the worse it is, the more you need to be focused on the objective. I think the whole point about talking about international cooperation, we heard that in so many sessions, resonate a lot with the IMF. At the end of the day, we are about what? IMF is about macroeconomic stability. This is about job, it's a growth, employment, and we need international cooperation. Today more than ever. And I think that was a key point about the SIPRI Forum, which resonates a lot with us.
Thank you so much, Franck. It's been really, really insightful, and it's a pleasure to hear that there is this ambition now to partner up and act in a decisive, coherent way with other international community members, towards a better future. Thanks a lot. I would like to give you a hand, and I hope that you agree.